Hey everybody, welcome to the fifth and final video for chapter 30, and in this one we're going to be talking about the end of the Cold War. Now the Cold War ends with the breakup of the Soviet Union, right? You know, if the Cold War was between the two superpowers, you look at them in the top left, you've got the US and the Soviet Union, and if the Soviet Union doesn't exist anymore, then obviously the Cold War can't keep on going. But as you can see from both that picture and the bottom middle picture, relations between the two was slowly starting to thaw a little bit. It was slowly starting to get a little better. It never fully got better. You know, it wasn't like we became allies before the Soviet Union collapsed, but we weren't quite at each other's throats the way that we were during the 1950s and 60s. So, as I said, it ends in 91 with the breakup of the Soviet Union, but the collapse of, this superpower, of this military giant, and the decline of communism in Europe, as you see in the top right, with the fall of the Berlin Wall, it was part of a pretty long process. All right, first let's get into the decline of the Soviet Union. So, as a strictly communist government throughout most of its history, the Soviet Union implemented a command economy. Command economy is where the government makes all decisions from top to bottom. And it was largely a failure by the 1980s. You had grain shortages due to years of collectivization. You had inefficient use of resources due to too much government control. Very little in the way of consumer production, and overall a lack of incentive for workers to do well. What you'd see in a lot of stores where there was shops, supermarkets, department stores was extreme shortages, food shortages, consumer goods shortages. Right, this was very, very common throughout most communist countries, but especially in the Soviet Union in the 1980s. You know, a major criticism of socialism and communism is that without personal incentives for the accumulation of more wealth, human nature hasn't really shown much of a desire to do well. You know, that we need that incentive for being paid. And if that's not there, well, you're just not going to do too much. So besides internal economic problems, there was also an increasing demand within Eastern Europe for reform. You know, the Prague Spring might have been crushed back in the 1960s, but that didn't extinguish the desire for democratic reforms in the communist bloc. Now, we're going to come back and talk a little bit more about Eastern Europe later, so we'll just kind of table that for a little bit later in the video. But another severe problem for the Soviet Union was coming from a very different region. The Central Asian country of Afghanistan had turned into a nightmare for the Soviets. So you look on the map, here's the Soviet Union, okay, which includes in a lot of countries today that are not a part of, Russia. You've got your Central Asian ones like Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan and so forth. But just south of that here, the green country, you've got Afghanistan. Now, Afghanistan has been involved in, conflicts with Russia going back to the 1800s. But in 1979, the USSR invaded Afghanistan in order to protect a pro-communist government. All right, remember, Cold War, US wanted to contain it, Soviet Union wanted to spread communism. Now, they were fiercely resisted by Afghan fighters that were known as the Mujahideen. The Mujahideen, as I said, they were Afghan fighters, and they were given money, they were given supplies, and they were given weapons by the CIA. Let me move me here. That's a Stinger missile. That's an anti-aircraft missile. The Mujahideen were not making these on their own. Okay, this was coming from the Americans. And when the Soviets saw, herders and simple farmers fighting with advanced weaponry like that, they knew where it was coming from. So remember, this was another proxy war in this ongoing struggle between the two superpowers. And as I said, the Soviet Union, it was very easy for them to figure out where these Stinger missiles and advanced weaponry was coming from. So it did worsen U.S.-Soviet relations. But America did get the outcome that it wanted, since Afghanistan had turned into Russia's, quote, Vietnam. Now, what do we mean by that? Well, remember when we talked about Vietnam in the previous video. It was very expensive, it was very costly, and it was very unpopular. And that was the same thing with Afghanistan and the Soviet Union. The mighty Soviet army couldn't bring these guys, herders living out in the mountains, they couldn't defeat them the same way that we couldn't defeat the Vietnamese. So eventually the mighty Soviet military was forced to leave without achieving its objective. Now, the final nail didn't come from an armed conflict, though. It came unintentionally from within. And it came from this guy, Mikhail Gorbachev. Let me back down here. Now, Gorbachev was the last premier of the Soviet Union, although he didn't intend to be. He came to power in 1985, and a big priority of his was easing tensions between the USSR and the USA. He signed arms control treaties with the U.S. Here you see a photograph of, that's him on the left. Gorbachev was a big, kind of his defining physical characteristics was this birthmark. It was a blood mark on the top of his forehead. He was very well known for that. And then you have on the right, you have President Reagan. He was president of the United States from 1980 to 88, kind of the really last phase of the Cold War. So he also put forth two reforms that he thought would help, but ended up leading to the end of his country. And the first one is glasnost. Now, glasnost means openness. He ended censorship. He allowed for more open criticism of the government. The other reform was perestroika. Now, you do have to remember these. I know they're Russian terms, but it is important to remember what they are. Perestroika means restructuring. It reduced the size of government influence. It allowed for some private ownership of farms and businesses, right? So a little bit similar to Lenin's new economic policy. Gorbachev thought that allowing some non-communist policies would lead to improved economic production and would therefore appease the people. He was wrong. All right, before we get into that, though, let's first talk about how communism ends in Eastern Europe. With the power of the Soviet Union diminished, and thanks to the openings created by glasnost and perestroika, Eastern European nations were now demanding reform and many of them full independence from Soviet control. Now, the Soviet Union wasn't in a position of power to send in the tanks like it did in the 1950s and 60s to crush any rebellions. And therefore, by the 1980s, a lot of changes were underway, such as Poland. Now, economic hardships in the 1980s had led to the rise of a labor union known as Solidarity. All right, there you see kind of at a rally for Solidarity, and the gentleman in the forefront there with the mustache, that is Lech Walesa. He was the leader of Solidarity, and he kind of led them from being just a simple labor union into actually being a major political force. Walesa was extremely popular, and the Soviets realized that they couldn't control him. They couldn't even keep him in prison because of public outcry within Poland. And when the Soviet Union was forced to allow free elections for the first time in 50 years, Walesa was elected president. Now, and then right after he took office, communism was officially done in Poland. And likewise, it ended in East Germany. Now, the resistance here was a little more severe. It was coming from more active protests, and protesters were demanding changes. Now, a lot of these protesters were aimed at the Berlin Wall. As we discussed earlier, the Berlin Wall was a symbol for communist oppression. And then finally, in November 1989, it was torn down, reuniting the city of Berlin. The following year, open elections were held that reunited East and West Germany. This was a major event, kind of not only the dissolution of the communist government in East Germany, but the reunification of both East and West Germany that a lot of people didn't think would happen anytime soon. I'll show you some pictures from it. The same picture that I had on the opening slide, the very famous photo of a huge chunk of the wall being torn down. As you can see, it took on almost like a party-like atmosphere, and by that point you can see how the wall had fallen into disrepair and the graffiti had become rampant on it, but still it was up. It had been up since 1961, so it was up for almost 30 years. And you see people would go up and they would take sledgehammers and pickaxes and chip away on it in order to take chunks of it as souvenirs and so forth. So it was a big cause of celebration. And the picture here on the right would be a couple of years after the fall of the Berlin Wall, where the two Germanys were finally reunited, and just a huge celebratory atmosphere back in Germany. So now let's get into the actual end of the Soviet Union. So the problem with Gorbachev's reforms was that they really didn't make anybody happy. Hardcore communists saw them as a betrayal, giving in to kind of Western powers and Western influence, and progressive reformers didn't think that they went far enough. Right? They thought it was too little. So plus, there were an awful lot of problems that came about because of glasnost and perestroika. There was economic crisis. Right? The economy had been trained for decades to run on total government control as being a command economy. It couldn't handle private ownership that quickly. Factories closed, unemployment rates went up, production declined, inflation was rampant, so you had all sorts of economic crisis. Plus, now because of glasnost, people felt empowered to speak out against the government. And not just in Russia, right? You saw this in Eastern Europe. You also saw this in the other Soviet states. Nationalist movements arose throughout the Soviet republics. It's important to remember that the Soviet Union was not just Russia. Okay, it was a multinational, multi-ethnic nation. You had Eastern European countries such as the Baltic ones, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, Belarus, Ukraine. You had your Stan countries, as I mentioned before, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, small little ones down here on the border of Central Asia, such as Azerbaijan and Armenia. Russia dominated it, right? Russia was kind of synonymous with it, but it wasn't just Russia. And now, with the Soviet Union decline, a lot of these countries are demanding their independence now. They saw kind of this overall resistance to communism as opportunity for them to break away. Now, all of this, the reforms, the demands for independence, this was really angering the old school communists in the Soviet Union. And a group of them had had enough of Gorbachev. And in 1991, there was an attempted coup. Now, a coup d'etat is a overthrow of the government. Now, it didn't succeed, although the symbolism of it, of tanks going through, Moscow, you see the Kremlin in the background there, it still was very powerful. The fact that it failed also didn't really save Gorbachev. Right, here you have an iconic image of, Russian government leaders. And that's important, not Soviet government leaders, because this flag that they're waving here is a Russian flag, not a Soviet flag. And this gentleman here in the forefront, that's Boris Yeltsin. He was a Russian nationalist leader, and he would become the first president of Russia after the breakup of the Soviet Union. He really became the face of the resistance to the coup. Even though it was meant to try and take Gorbachev out, and these guys weren't necessarily fans of his, they still thought that this is not the way to do it. So he became the new face for Russian power. As I said, it showed that Gorbachev's time was over. And that he kind of took that as a cue, and he soon resigned after that. And then by the end of the year, by the end of 1991, all of the Soviet states had broken away from the Soviet Union. And without having separate Soviet republics, they realized that there is no Soviet Union anymore. Okay, whoops, thought that was on the bottom. So statues of Lenin were being torn down. Cities like Stalingrad and Leningrad were being renamed, and the Soviet Union was officially disbanded. And therefore, the Cold War is over. All right, so that wraps things up with the Cold War. It also wraps things up for Chapter 30.